When the Galactic Council hanged a human, the galaxy burned in revenge. The tribunal door closed in my face for the third time that morning, and in that moment I understood with absolute certainty that every appeal I had left to make was already dead. My name is Nina Cole. I spent 11 years as a combat negotiator with the European Defense Corps before the United Nations placed me at the Grand Council Station, orbiting Veth Prime as Earth's senior diplomatic attaché. I have sat across tables from species who breathe methane and argued points of interstellar law until the lights in the chamber cycled off automatically. I am not someone who frightens easily or stops trying without good reason. But standing in that corridor, watching the Veth guards press their four-fingered hands against the chamber seals and hearing the final, airtight click of the lock, something hollow opened inside my chest. Jonas Hail was behind that door. He had been behind it for 6 days. He was a freighter captain, 43 years old, born on the coast of Devon in England, with deep sun lines carved around his eyes from years of squinting at docking lights through viewport glass. He named his ships after rivers. His current one was the Avon. He was the type of man who remembered the first name of every dock worker he had ever worked with, and who was constitutionally incapable of passing a person in trouble without stopping. It was a quality his friends admired and his shipping company tolerated. It was also the quality that had put him in that room. 3 weeks before his arrest, Jonas had been hauling a standard ore shipment through the Cathara shipping lanes when his sensor array caught a distress frequency originating from deep inside the Veth Nebula. The nebula was designated sacred territory under a treaty older than Earth's written records. Non-Veth vessels were forbidden from entering under any circumstances. Warning frequencies broadcast continuously at the boundary markers. The markers themselves were enormous, lit, and unmissable. Everything about that boundary had been designed to make the message clear. The signal was coming from a Draloon passenger liner, 91 people aboard, life support failing at a rate that left no room for relay messages or consultation. Jonas had approximately 12 minutes before the math became permanent. He turned the Avon around and went in. He brought 47 of them out alive. He strapped emergency pods to the exterior hull of his ship, 3 rows deep in some sections, and pushed his engines to 30% past their rated tolerance, bleeding the system dry just to clear the nebula boundary before everything gave out. When the rescue vessels reached the survivors, several of them were still trembling. A Draloon child was clutching a piece of Jonas's work jacket. She had grabbed it when he carried her to the pod, and no one had been able to get her to release it. Her mother told me about it later, crying in 3 different languages at once in the way that Draloon do when the emotion is too large for one. The Veth boarded the Avon before Jonas had finished the docking cycle. The charge was cosmic trespass and desecration of sacred Veth territory. Under the ancient founding code of the Galactic Council, still binding by treaty, the penalty was death. No exceptions. No appeals to motive or intent. No weight given to outcome. The law was the law, and the law had been written 40,000 years before Jonas Hail's great-great-grandmother was born. I filed 42 formal objections in 6 days. I sent legal challenges to the Council's Justice Division at every available hour. I contacted Earth's ambassador, Henry Voss, who was already burning his engines at full capacity on the way back from a trade summit in the outer colonies. I reached out to the Draloon delegation, who were privately horrified and publicly absent from every forum where Jonas's name came up. I contacted the Keth High Ministers, the Lorathi Confederation envoys, the myriad collective representatives. Every single one of them said a version of the same thing. They were sorry. They could not formally oppose the Veth. The Veth held 12 seats on the council. They had been there from the first session. Their legal code was woven into the Council's founding framework in a way that could not be separated from the institution without unraveling the institution. To challenge them was to challenge everything, and no species in that chamber was willing to do that. not over one human being from a small, new civilization that had only been at the table for 11 years. On the third day, I went to see High Speaker Velothar directly. She was ancient in a way that went beyond years. She sat in her chambers draped with 40,000-year-old tapestries and looked at me with eyes like polished black stone, completely composed, completely still. The kind of stillness that is not peace but the result of having outlasted everything that ever tried to disturb it. I told her everything. I told her that Jonas Hail had made a decision in a 12-minute window with 47 lives in the balance, and that any legal framework worth the civilization that built it must make room for that kind of decision. I told her about the child and the jacket. She told me the nebula had been sacred since before humans discovered agriculture. She told me the boundary was clearly marked and the law did not bend for individual circumstances. She said it with such complete absence of doubt that for a moment I almost believed her. I asked her, very quietly, if she had ever saved a stranger's life herself. The silence that followed lasted 11 seconds. I counted every one of them. She asked me to leave. On the morning of the 7th day, the Veth sent the broadcast across the entire galactic network. Every world received it. Every screen, every open channel, every public feed. They made certain of complete coverage. They wanted maximum reach. I was already standing in the central public square of Council Station when the guards brought Jonas through the main archway. They had kept him in his own clothes. I understood immediately that this was intentional. The Veth wanted every species watching to see a human being. They wanted the image to be unambiguous, to carry a message that required no translation or diplomatic framing. Jonas walked into the square and looked around at the gathered crowd. There were hundreds of beings present from more than a dozen species, watching from the observation rails above and the open floor below. He looked around at all of them slowly and then he found me. I was 40 feet back in the crowd. I still do not know how he found me. He just did. He was calm, not the blankness of someone who has broken, but the genuine settled calm of a person who has looked directly at what is coming and decided how he wants to meet it. He found my face, and he nodded. Once. The way you nod at someone you trust. The way you say goodbye without wanting to make it look like goodbye. I nodded back. It was the only thing I could give him. I had learned the previous night, through a contact in the Council Intelligence Division, that the Veth historians had spent weeks studying human history before selecting the method of execution. They had reviewed records going back centuries. They had many options. They chose the rope specifically because of what it meant in human memory, because it appeared throughout our history as an instrument of suppression, used by those with power to silence and diminish people they had decided were beneath full consideration. They chose it because they wanted every human watching to feel that meaning in the oldest and deepest part of their memory. They wanted to say something that went past law and diplomacy, past treaties and legal codes, straight down to the most basic possible message. We know what you are, and this is your level. Jonas died in seconds. He did not struggle. He did not make a sound. He left nothing behind that could be used for anything except remembering him. He was there, and then he was gone, and the square was quiet in the specific way that places go quiet when something permanent has just happened. I stood there for a long time. The grief that settled into me was not the explosive kind. It was dense and permanent and absolutely clear, the kind that becomes part of your structure and does not leave. I breathed through it and held it and let it do what it needed to do. Around me, the crowd was beginning to move, beings from a dozen species drifting back toward their routines, and the lights of Council Station hummed overhead exactly as they always did, completely indifferent to everything that had just occurred beneath them. But underneath the grief, something else was forming. I recognized it the way you recognize a smell from your childhood, immediately and completely. Not rage. Rage burns bright and then empties. This was something older, something patient and precise and fully committed. The quality that surfaces in human beings when something crosses a final line and they stop asking permission and start doing what needs to be done. The Veth had reached back into human history to find that rope. They had found it and they had read what it symbolized. But they had stopped reading too early. They had not read what always came after it. Because in 4 centuries of human records, not once did someone use that rope to define a people and then remain comfortable. Not once. Every single time, it became the moment the story changed direction. Before I left the square, I sent one message to Earth. 6 words. No encryption necessary. Every human being receiving it would already understand everything it needed to say. The message read, "They chose the rope, remember that." Then I walked back through the corridor, where the tribunal door had shut me out 7 days in a row, and I stopped being a diplomat. I watched the broadcast from my office at Solar Fleet Command in Cape Town, sitting completely still for the 4 minutes and 19 seconds it lasted. My name is Owen Drake. I have been an admiral in the Solar Defense Fleet for 9 years. Before that, I spent 16 years as a deep space tactician running operations in environments where communication delays meant your first decision had to be your best decision, because there was no time for a second one. I think slowly and move fast. When I stop speaking, I am usually 3 decisions ahead of the conversation everyone else thinks we are having. When the broadcast ended, I switched off the screen and sat in the silence and listened to Cape Town come apart outside my window. It was not violent. It was just loud. The particular sound a city makes when its people have all received the same news at the same moment and are all feeling the same thing at the same time. I had heard cities sound like that before, but only a few times, and always at moments that ended up in history books. Within 90 minutes, I had reports coming in from every human settlement in the solar system. The Luna City colonies, the Mars settlements, Titan Station, Europa Base, the deep outposts at the edge of our territorial boundary. Every single report said the same thing in different language. The people were not quiet. The people were not going to accept this. The grief was real, and the determination underneath the grief was realer still. And anyone who had spent more than 10 minutes around a human being in their life could have told the Veth exactly how this was going to go. My communications officer, a young man named Cal Norris, 3 years in the fleet, with a photograph of his younger sister propped on the corner of his workstation, came into my office with a tablet loaded with incoming messages and set it on my desk without a word. His face told me the state of the fleet faster than any written report. I went through everything. Formal diplomatic protests from Ambassador Henry Voss, who was still in transit at full engine burn and whose careful professional language was doing very little to conceal the fury underneath it. Earth Senate emergency session convened 40 minutes after the broadcast. Intelligence analysis from our strategic division detailing Veth military posture and the combined fleet strength of all 14 council species. Preliminary casualty projections. Response timeline modeling. The intelligence analysis was honest. The solar fleet had 61 active warships. The combined council fleet exceeded 800 vessels across 14 member species, with coordinated command infrastructure, established joint fleet doctrine, and centuries of combined operational experience. Every conventional military model in the report projected a human defeat within weeks if we engaged directly. The analysts were thorough. They had included margin of error figures. It was very careful work. I set the reports on the edge of my desk and looked out the window at Cape Town for a long time. The analysts were not wrong. They were solving for the wrong problem. I had spent 16 years studying the kind of conflict that does not appear in the famous military histories, not the celebrated fleet engagements where superior numbers and firepower carried the day in a straightforward fashion. The other kind, the patient, embedded, asymmetric kind of conflict where a smaller force with intimate knowledge of a specific environment made life deeply uncomfortable for forces that should have been able to end things without effort. The kind where the decisive factor was not how hard you could strike, but how completely you understood the space you were both standing in. Humanity had spent 11 years as the smallest, newest member of the Galactic Council. The Council powers had looked at us and made a comfortable assessment. Small fleet, limited territory, young civilization with no deep institutional roots in the galactic community, manageable in every dimension that the older species knew how to measure. They had opened certain doors for us because we were useful, and had kept the important doors closed because we were not equals, and they had watched us make ourselves useful in the spaces they allowed us, and felt entirely comfortable with the arrangement. They had stopped watching carefully. That was their error. I pulled up a different set of files, not fleet strength reports, personnel deployment records, every human being currently living and working in council-controlled space. I went through the list methodically, category by category, world by world. Traders with permanent docking access at 14 council ports. Engineers holding active maintenance credentials for power relay networks on 6 worlds. Systems technicians who had been servicing the same infrastructure nodes for years, some for a full decade. Communication relay operators who knew those networks better than the species who originally built them, because the original builders had handed off the physical maintenance long ago and stopped thinking about what happened inside the junction boxes. Medical staff, atmospheric processing contractors, dock supervisors, life support maintenance crews. 11 years of being the small, useful, available species had placed human beings in a very specific position. We had gone where we were needed and taken the work that other species found beneath them, and done it with the thoroughness that comes from knowing you cannot afford to do anything poorly. We had quietly threaded ourselves into the infrastructure layers that made galactic civilization function, and we had done it so consistently and reliably that those layers had become invisible to the beings who depended on them. 4,218 people. Every one of them had watched the same broadcast. I called Cal Norris back into the office and told him to close the door. I told him the framework of what I was considering, not the full operational plan, because the full plan was still assembling itself in the back of my mind, but the shape of it, the essential logic. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the qualities I valued most in him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at me with the expression of someone who has just heard something they need a few seconds to fully absorb. He asked me if I was serious. I told him I had never been more serious about anything in 9 years of command, and that he should begin preparing the secure communication channels within the hour. Over the next 14 hours, I made contact with those 4,000 people, one conversation at a time, working around communication delays and time zone differences, and the particular challenge of reaching people embedded in monitored environments. I talked to dock supervisors on Keth orbital platforms. I talked to engineers who had been maintaining power infrastructure on Veth Prime for years. I talked to communications technicians on relay platforms that served 3 different species networks simultaneously. I talked to a woman named Bate Holland, who had been running atmospheric maintenance contracts on the Draloon homeworld for 7 years, and who, when my message finally reached her, had been sitting in her quarters since the broadcast with her tools already laid out on the table in front of her, waiting for exactly this. I did not ask anyone to destroy anything. I did not ask anyone to cause injury to any being. What I asked was a single, specific thing. On a date and at a time I would confirm in a follow-up message, I asked each of them to stop, to put down their tools, to step back from their posts, to stop doing the thing they did every day that kept pieces of the galactic infrastructure operational, not permanently, not even for long. Just long enough for the galaxy to understand something it had been comfortable not understanding for 11 years. Just long enough to feel what it felt like when the invisible hands that had been holding things together opened. Every person I contacted said yes. Some said it before I finished asking. Pete Garner, who had been running power relay maintenance on a VETH orbital platform for 4 years, told me he had been wondering when someone was going to call. He said he already had a list of 17 specific relay nodes whose simultaneous interruption would produce the most significant and diagnostic results. I told him to use his judgment. He sounded like a man who had been waiting a long time to use it. After the infrastructure calls, I moved to the fleet commanders. I gave the order for full readiness deployment across all 61 ships. The commanders asked the expected question about the force differential. 800 Council vessels against 60 was not a disparity that conventional analysis could talk its way around. I told them to set that concern aside and focus on the readiness order. When some of them pressed, I told them something I meant completely. I told them that 61 ships crewed by human beings who had all watched that broadcast and who were currently operating with the particular combination of grief and absolute focused purpose that I was observing in every person I spoke to that day, were not the same 61 ships that appeared in the Council's tactical analysis reports. The models were built on numbers. Numbers did not capture what I was looking at. They trusted me. That was enough to begin. Ruth Hale found my personal communications line at 3 in the morning. She was Jonas's younger sister from Bristol, and someone at the UN had given her my contact details because she had asked, and there was no reasonable argument for refusing. She was not calling to demand a war. She was not calling to ask for anything specific. She just wanted to know, in the simplest and most direct terms, whether anyone was doing something. I told her yes. I told her that her brother had saved 47 lives and had chosen to do it fully aware of what it would cost him, and that the galaxy was going to know his name for longer than the VETH High Council had held its current session. She was quiet for a moment, then she thanked me and ended the call. I went back to my star maps. I had a great deal of work still to do, and the sun was already beginning to come up over the ocean. The signal reached me at 11:47 at night, VETH Prime local time, while I was sitting in my maintenance quarters eating cold food from a sealed container and staring at the ceiling. My name is Clara Webb. I have been living on VETH Prime for 6 years under a maintenance contractor identity that I built with such care and inhabited so completely that there are days when the other name feels like the one that belongs to someone else. I hold active credentials for atmospheric processing systems, power relay networks, and emergency environmental controls across the northern district of the capital. I have repaired the same 12 power junction boxes enough times that I could work through them in complete darkness, which I have in fact done on 3 occasions when the overnight lighting in the maintenance corridors failed. I was 28 years old when Earth Intelligence placed me here as part of an embedded program that the Strategic Division had been quietly running for 9 years. The program's premise was simple: put human technicians with genuine, verifiable skills into positions of real infrastructure responsibility across as many council worlds as could be arranged. Document their access, their knowledge, their familiarity with each system. Wait. For what exactly? The briefings had always been somewhat indirect, for the moment when knowing where all the switches were would matter. That moment had arrived. The signal was one word. It came in on a frequency I had been given on my first deployment day, a frequency I monitored on hardware I had built myself from components bought in small, unremarkable quantities from various supply vendors across the capital over the course of 3 years. The word was the one that had been chosen before any of us knew what we would be activated to do, before any of us had known what it would mean. The word was rope. I sat up. I set the food container on the floor. I looked at that word on the small screen for a long time. I already knew what had happened. Every human being in the galaxy knew. I had watched the broadcast twice. I had sat with it afterward in the quiet, settled way that I imagine every one of the 4,000 people scattered across council worlds had sat with it. Jonas Hail was not a name I had known personally. That did not matter. You did not need a personal connection to understand what his death meant or to feel it in a way that went well past professional. I put on my maintenance uniform. I collected my tools. I checked each one by habit, the way I had checked them every working day for 6 years. Then I went to work. Veth Prime's Northern Capital District runs on a power relay network that was originally designed by Keth engineers approximately 200 years ago. It had been maintained almost exclusively by human contractors for the past 11 years. The Veth had their own technical staff, but their technical staff preferred administrative and supervisory roles. The Keth had built the original system and then transitioned maintenance responsibility once the construction phase was complete, the way an architect hands off a building and stops worrying about the plumbing. Human contractors had moved in because we were available, affordable, and dependable, and had stayed because once a human being truly understands a system, they understand it more completely than anyone who only ever reads about it in a manual. I knew the Northern District relay network the way I knew my own heartbeat. I moved through the capital in the dark, using maintenance access corridors that did not appear on any public map and that I had documented through 6 years of daily use. I passed 19 Veth citizens on the surface streets, none of whom looked at me for more than a moment. A human in a contractor uniform carrying a tool case at night was a completely ordinary sight. That was the central advantage of being invisible. You stop being seen by people who see you every day. My first target was the central relay hub for the Eastern Power Grid. This node distributed power to 9 government buildings, including 2 council administration centers, a primary communications relay tower, and the administrative complex that contained the High Speaker's office. I had accessed this node so many times that the access system acknowledged my credentials before I finished entering them. I did not break anything. I did not disable anything. I made 4 precise adjustments to the load balancing configuration. The kind of adjustments that take 3 minutes to implement and take 4 to 5 hours to diagnose and reverse if you do not know precisely what you are looking at. The kind that leave no obvious damage, no clear point of failure, just a system running against its own assumptions in ways that cascade quietly outward. Then I moved to the next node. 3 other human contractors were working different sections of the capital that night. We had coordinated our targets in advance through the same secure channel that had delivered the activation signal. We were not in contact during the operation itself. We did not need to be. Each of us had a specific area of deep familiarity and a specific list of targets, and 6 years of careful experience had given each of us exactly the judgment needed to work independently. At 12:40 in the morning, the first government building went dark. By 2 council administration centers had lost power. The communications relay tower switched to its backup systems, which drew additional load from the eastern grid, which was already running against altered parameters, which caused the atmospheric processing system for the underground transit network to trigger its safety overrides. The transit system halted. The backup processors engaged and pulled from a secondary grid, which I had pre-configured 30 minutes earlier to route through a node I had already adjusted. I listened to it unfold through the readout on my monitoring equipment as I moved between positions. It was not explosive. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, relentless logic of a complex interdependent system encountering a reality that violated its design assumptions, cascading through itself exactly the way all such systems do when one careful hand reaches in and changes something foundational. The buildings did not explode. The streets did not flood. The citizens of Veth Prime simply found, one by one, that things which had always worked were no longer working, and that nobody could immediately explain why. The emergency response began at 1:15. I was in a subterranean access corridor beneath the 3rd relay hub when I heard the procedural alarms begin above me. Then voices. Then the organized, purposeful movement of Veth technical teams beginning to deploy through the district. I knew their methodology from the emergency response drill I had once attended as a contractor observer. They would work from the most obvious point of failure outward, in sequence, checking each component against the expected baseline. It was a thorough and logical approach that would eventually find every adjustment I had made. The first one would take them approximately 40 minutes to locate, understanding that it was one of a set of linked changes rather than an isolated fault would take another 2 hours. The full picture, including the realization that all 12 nodes had been targeted with coordinated intent, would not arrive until morning. On 11 other council worlds, it was already morning. I was completing my 4th adjustment when footsteps sounded in the access corridor that did not match the ordinary maintenance pattern. These were fast and deliberate, the movement of someone following a specific trail rather than responding to a general system alert. A Veth security commander came around the corner into my corridor 14 seconds later. He was large even by Veth standards, wearing the dark blue uniform of the Capital Security Division, with the 4-bar rank insignia of a senior officer at his collar. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at my contractor uniform. He looked at my tool case. He looked at the secured access corridor and the time and the ongoing power event happening above us, and his hand moved toward the communication device on his wrist. I had been studying Veth anatomy during my personal hours for approximately 4 years. The contractor training program included access to a significant body of Veth medical and physiological literature, intended to help maintenance workers avoid accidentally injuring Veth citizens in confined working spaces. I found that information useful in a different context. The commander was sitting safely against the corridor wall in less than 5 seconds, completely unharmed and unconscious. I verified his vital signs, confirmed his position was stable, and left him where he was. He would wake with a moderate headache and a clear memory of a human contractor's face, which was acceptable because I had already arranged to report my contractor identity as inactive the following morning as part of a planned exit protocol. I completed my final adjustment, locked the panel behind me, and moved to the extraction route. Somewhere above me, Veth Prime was having the most disorienting night it had experienced in its recorded history, and in the orbital space above this planet, 60 ships were already moving. I thought about Jonas Hail as I moved through the dark corridors toward the extraction point. A man who had turned a freighter into a forbidden nebula to pull strangers out of the dark, and who had been calm enough at the worst moment of his life to find one specific face in a crowd of hundreds and nod at her. He would not have asked for any of this. He would have been uncomfortable with it, probably. He was the kind of man who helped people, because it was the right thing to do, and felt no need for anything to follow from it. But I believed he would have understood it, because he was also the kind of man who knew that actions taken with pure intent do not always get to be small and contained. Sometimes the thing you do becomes the thing that changes the direction of everything that comes after, and you just have to trust that the people carrying it forward are doing it for reasons that would not embarrass you. I reached the extraction point at 2:47. A transport was waiting, running dark. The pilot was a young man named Dan Marsh, 26 years old, who had been sitting in that vehicle for 4 hours and who asked me one question when I climbed in. He asked, did it work? I told him to check the power grid status on his navigation scanner. He looked at the screen for a moment. Then he looked at me. Then he started the engines and said absolutely nothing for the rest of the flight, which I interpreted as its own kind of answer. The council fleet came out of transit at 4 in the morning, and it was exactly as large as the intelligence reports had predicted. 812 vessels. I watched them resolve on the tactical display one cluster at a time as their transit drives cycled down, spreading across the space in front of us in a formation that I could tell from its geometry was designed to be seen as much as to function. They wanted us to look at it. They wanted us to count. They had arranged 800 ships the way you arrange an argument that is intended to end a conversation before it starts. My name is Owen Drake, and I was standing on the bridge of the Endurance, our largest operational ship, a cruiser that my crew had maintained with such consistent care that every system ran 4 to 6% above its rated specification. Around me, spread across 200,000 kilometers of open space, were the other 60 warships of the Solar Fleet, arranged in a formation that, viewed on a tactical display, looked somewhat irregular, not disordered. Just not the tight, layered hierarchical structure that standard fleet doctrine called for. That was entirely intentional. My communications officer, Cal Norris, who had transferred to the Endurance Bridge crew 2 days before departure, informed me that the Council fleet was sending a hailing signal. He asked whether to respond. I told him not yet. I told him to let them look at us for a while first. I watched the Council formation settle into its full deployment configuration on the tactical display. 800 ships from 14 species, with different hull architectures and drive signatures and weapon specifications, holding a coordinated line that required significant joint command infrastructure to sustain. They had sent everyone. The Veth warships, long and pale and angular, anchored the front. The Keth heavy cruisers, dense and dark, formed a second layer behind them. The Lorathi fast attack vessels held the flanks, fast and aggressive even in holding position. It was an impressive formation. It was the kind of formation designed to end things in a single, overwhelming exchange. I had spent 4 days running simulations before this moment. Not standard fleet engagement models. Those were already resolved in the enemy's favor by arithmetic alone, but different simulations. Models of every asymmetric engagement in human military history, where a significantly outnumbered force had achieved its objective. I had spent those 4 days identifying what those forces had consistently shared. 3 things appeared in almost every case. They did not fight the battle the larger force had prepared for. They created a different engagement in a different space on their own terms. They operated with complete tactical independence at every level of command. No waiting for orders from a centralized structure that could be located and neutralized. Every unit acting on its own judgment toward a shared objective. Their objective was specific and limited. They were not trying to destroy the larger force. They were trying to make that force understand something, and they stopped the moment the message was received. I had briefed every one of my 60 captains on all 3 points in detail before departure. I had told them that their mission was not to defeat 800 ships in a conventional exchange. Their mission was to demonstrate one thing clearly and then disengage. I had told each of them that from the moment the engagement began, they had complete command authority over their own ship. No formation to hold. No orders to wait for. Protect your crew. Pursue the objective. Trust your training. The objective was to make 800 ships understand that 60 had decided there was nothing to be afraid of. I let the Council formation hold for 6 minutes, long enough for the waiting to create its own question in their minds. Then I opened the channel myself. The voice that came back was deep and deliberate. A Veth fleet commander named Otharvel, recognizable from Council military records as one of their most experienced officers. He told me that the combined fleet was authorized by the Galactic Council to enforce a compliance order against Earth and all human territories. He listed the specific violations: unauthorized infrastructure disruption on 12 Council worlds, unprovoked military advance into Council-protected space. He told me that the Council required an immediate and full withdrawal and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and that compliance would be met with a proportionate rather than comprehensive response. I listened to the entire statement without interrupting. Then I asked him how the power was running on Veth Prime. There was a pause, short but unmistakably there. I told him that I would be prepared to discuss a resolution once Earth had a permanent, equal voting seat on the Galactic Council. Once full legal protections for all human citizens in Council space were formally codified into Council law. And once Jonas Hail, freighter captain of Earth, was publicly recognized in permanent form as a person who had acted with moral integrity and would be honored accordingly. He told me those terms were not under consideration. I told him I understood, and I closed the channel. Then I sent one word to every ship in the fleet. What followed for the next 3 hours was unlike any engagement I had studied or run in simulation, and I have studied a great many. There was no battle line, no moment where fleets met in a defined exchange zone. What happened was that 60 ships, operated by people who had been given complete freedom of action and who had a single clear purpose, went to work on 800 ships that were waiting to fight a battle that was not being offered to them. The Council formation needed its opponents to behave like opponents. It needed targets that held position long enough to be engaged, that maintained patterns predictable enough to be countered. It needed the 60 to organize themselves like 60 ships. My captains did not organize themselves like 60 ships. They moved as 60 independent decisions, each operating on its own logic, each pursuing the same objective through completely different means. They formed brief pairs and small groups, then separated before patterns could be established. They came in from angles that the larger vessels' targeting systems were not configured to track efficiently. They struck at navigational cores and propulsion systems and weapons targeting arrays, not hulls. Not crew. Every action had a specific intended outcome, and the intended outcome was never destruction. The intended outcome was, you cannot stop us, and we are not even trying to end you. Dan Harrow, captain of the scout vessel Swift, took his ship through a gap in the Veth front formation that the Veth geometric arrangement had not accounted for, because no commander designing a formation for 800 ships against 60 builds gap coverage for a single vessel moving at that angle at that speed. He came out on the far side of the front line, behind the Veth command vessel, before anyone on either side had fully processed the movement. He did not fire on the command vessel. He held position 30 kilometers off its port side for 45 full seconds, during which the command vessel could not maneuver or fire or communicate without risking the engagement, and then he was gone before the response elements could reach him. The Veth command vessel spent 9 minutes in a full defensive hold doing nothing. 9 minutes of 800 ships waiting for orders that could not be transmitted cleanly. The Keth heavy cruisers, which were powerful and slow and designed to deliver concentrated force into a fixed target, discovered that there were no fixed targets. They kept redirecting toward the nearest movement, which meant they kept nearly colliding with each other and with the Lorathi fast attack vessels, who were attempting to do the opposite thing in the same space. The Council formation began developing internal coordination failures within 40 minutes, not because we had cut their communications, but because a formation designed for a conventional engagement simply does not function when no conventional engagement is taking place. We took damage. I want to be precise about this. 14 of my ships were hit in the first hour, 3 of them seriously. The cruiser Forward lost 2 crew members in the opening exchange before its captain broke contact and fell back to repair range. Cal Norris read me those names from the casualty report in real time, and I held them alongside everything else I was tracking, and I did not look away from the tactical display. Every loss mattered. Every captain and every crew member on all 60 ships had known losses were possible before they left dock. They had been there anyway. At 2 hours 40 minutes, Otharvel began pulling his formation tighter, consolidating into a denser configuration that reduced the internal coordination failures. It was the tactically correct response to what we were doing. It also made his formation slower and significantly less responsive, which my captains identified and used within minutes. At 2 hours 58 minutes, he opened a channel. He asked me what terms I wanted. I told him I had already stated the terms and nothing had changed. He told me that the council could not accept the proposed terms without full consultation with the complete council body. He said the minimum required time was 72 hours. I told him that the solar fleet would hold its current position for 72 hours and advance no further. I told him that human infrastructure workers across council space would also pause all activities during that period as a good faith gesture to allow the consultation to proceed without external pressure. I told him that if the consultation concluded without producing the terms we had requested, we would resume, and the scope of what followed would not be subject to the same limitations as the current engagement. I said this without emphasis or drama, the way you state a fact about weather. He was silent for 11 seconds. Then he said he would relay the proposal to the council body. I closed the channel. I turned to Cal Norris, who was looking at me with an expression I could not entirely read. I asked him how the fleet was holding. He said 58 ships fully operational, sir, 2 in emergency repair status. Then he paused. He said, crew morale is something I do not have a measurement for. I asked him what he meant. He said, I mean I have never seen anything like it, sir, not in 3 years. I told him I had, many times in history books. He asked when. I told him, every single time a group of human beings decided together that they were done waiting for someone to give them permission. The doors of the Grand Council chamber opened for me without resistance. That is what I noticed first. Not the tiers of alien representatives above the chamber floor, not the murmur that moved through the room when I stepped inside, not the restored lights running at full power overhead after a week of the Veth explaining to their citizens why government buildings had been experiencing unusual outages. What I noticed was that the doors opened and kept opening, and no one put their hands on the seals. My name is Nina Cole, and I had spent 3 weeks being kept outside those doors. I walked in alone, no escort, no other diplomat at my shoulder. I was wearing my formal UN diplomatic uniform, which I had pressed that morning with the same careful attention I had once given to preparation for situations where everything depended on how the first 30 seconds went. I carried my documents under my arm, nothing else. The chamber was at full attendance. All 14 council species represented at their complete delegation strength, which I knew from 16 years of experience meant this session had been called at the highest level of urgency. The Veth delegation occupied their elevated position at the top of the tier, Velathar at its center, with the same obsidian composure she always carried. The Draloon delegation was in their designated section, and as I passed their level, the senior representative caught my eye and gave me one deliberate, small nod. I noted that and kept walking. I reached the speaker's floor. I set my documents on the surface. I looked up at the assembled representatives of 14 civilizations representing billions of years of combined history, and I waited. The chamber protocol required the presiding high speaker to formally open the floor before any representative began addressing the chamber. Velathar looked at me without moving for a long time. I looked back without moving. The silence stretched. She opened the floor. I thanked her and began. I had been working on this address for 3 days while monitoring fleet communications from Owen Drake and receiving situation reports from Clara Webb and the other contractors across council space. I had drafted it and revised it until every word was performing a specific function, not threatening, not emotional in any demonstrative sense, not the performance of grief or the demand for sympathy, just the truth, clearly stated by someone who was no longer requesting anything. I told the council that I was not present to discuss the events of the past 3 weeks in emotional terms. I told them I would not describe Jonas Hail's execution in detail or ask them to feel any particular thing about it, because the recording existed in the permanent archive of the Galactic Network broadcast, and was available to every being in the galaxy to view and evaluate according to their own standards. I told them I was here to present 3 requirements that Earth and all human territories were formally submitting as non-negotiable conditions of continued Council membership. The first was a permanent, fully equal voting seat on the Galactic Council, with identical standing, procedural rights, and legal access to every mechanism of the Council as any founding member species. Not a junior membership, not a conditional status, complete equality. The second was the immediate and permanent codification into Council law of full legal protections for all human citizens present in Council space. The right to a formal hearing before any legal penalty was administered, the right to representation, the explicit and permanent prohibition of execution for any act performed with the primary purpose of preserving life, regardless of territorial regulations or sacred designations. The third was a public monument, constructed on the grounds of Council Station and maintained in perpetuity, inscribed in all 47 languages of the Council's member species, commemorating Jonas Hail of Earth, who entered the Veth Nebula to save 47 lives and was executed for it. I let the silence hold for a moment after the third requirement. Then Velathar spoke. She said that humanity had advanced military vessels into Council space and conducted coordinated acts of infrastructure disruption on 12 member worlds. She said these actions constituted violations of the Council's foundational compact and could not be addressed through the granting of concessions at any scale. She said that Earth had responded to a lawfully conducted legal process with disproportionate and destabilizing action. She said the Council was prepared to discuss a path toward normalized relations, but that it would not begin from the position I had described. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "High Speaker, I would like to speak to this Council about human history." There was movement through the tiers, not objection, the specific quality of attention that an audience gives when they receive something they did not anticipate. I told the Council that I was going to provide them with a selected account of certain periods and patterns from Earth's past. I told them this was not intended to generate any particular emotional response. I told them the information was directly relevant to the deliberations they were currently undertaking, and that I believed they would find it useful. I began in the 14th century, and I worked forward. I described the pattern, the specific, recurring pattern in human history where one group with institutional power decided that another group did not warrant full consideration under law, and acted on that decision by exercising control over life and death, and what followed in every documented instance. I did not list every example. I selected specific ones and described them plainly, without dramatization, the way you describe documented historical fact. I described the role that public execution had played in these patterns, how it functioned not only as punishment but as communication, how it was designed to transmit a message to a watching population about their position and their worth, how that message, without exception across 4 centuries of cases, produced the precise opposite of its intended result, how it did not reduce the people it was directed at, how it unified them, how it created shared purpose in populations that had previously been divided, and how that unity intensified rather than exhausted itself over time. Then I described in specific terms what human populations in those situations typically did next. I described the organizational forms that emerged spontaneously, without central direction, in response to that kind of experience, the tactics that developed in groups that had no conventional military advantage, the specific capacity for long-term coordinated patience that manifests in human beings when they have been given a sufficiently clear and personal reason to act together. The historical record on this point was consistent across an enormous range of contexts and circumstances. It was not a theory. It was a pattern with documented instances across 400 years. The chamber was extremely quiet. I told the Council that I was not presenting this as a threat. I was presenting it as information. The Council had spent 11 years analyzing humanity through the variables of fleet size, territorial extent, and institutional standing in the galactic community. These were not the most predictive variables. The past 3 weeks had offered a direct empirical demonstration of which variables were actually relevant. I suggested that the Council's deliberation would benefit from incorporating that demonstration into their analysis. Then I said something that had not been in my prepared remarks. It arrived in the moment, and I said it without raising my voice or adding any particular weight to it. I said, "You chose the rope because you had studied our history. I am standing in front of you today because you stopped reading too soon." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. It was not the silence of beings waiting for something. It was the silence of beings sitting with something. The Draloon senior representative requested the floor. Velathar granted it after a pause. The representative stood. She was tall, as elder caste Draloon typically were, with the blue-gray coloration of advanced years and the particular measured quality of someone who had prepared carefully. She addressed the chamber in a voice that carried without effort. She said the Draloon delegation wished to formally address the Council on the subject of Jonas Hail. She said that 47 Draloon citizens were living, because a human freighter captain had made a decision that he understood the full cost of. She said the Draloon people had understood the nature of his act from the moment his ship cleared the nebula boundary with their people strapped to its hull, and had chosen silence in the days before his execution out of political calculation, and that the Draloon delegation was entering into the permanent proceedings record of the Galactic Council, a formal acknowledgement that this choice had been a failure, that their silence had been wrong, that Jonas Hail had deserved better from every species in that chamber that had privately mourned his death while publicly doing nothing to prevent it. She said the Draloon delegation was voting in favor of all 3 of Earth's requirements. Then she sat down. After the Draloon representative sat, the Lorathi delegation requested the floor. Then the Myriad Collective. Then the Keth, who argued procedurally about the monument language but supported the legal protections. Then, one after another, delegations that had been silent for 3 weeks began to speak. Not all of them agreed on every point. Not all of them were comfortable with the process that had brought us to this session. But they spoke, and what they said was honest in the way that things said late are sometimes more honest than things said early, when there is less to lose by speaking clearly. The Veth delegation did not speak again after Velathar's initial statement. They sat in their elevated position and listened, and Velathar's face showed nothing, which I had come to understand was its own kind of language. The vote was called at the 4-hour mark. 13 of 14 delegations voted to accept all 3 requirements. The Veth delegation entered an abstention, which in the Council's procedural framework was recorded as non-objection. The requirements passed and were entered into the permanent treaty record, binding on all member species from that session forward. I stood at the speaking position and watched the vote count resolve on the display above the speaker's position, and I let myself feel something that I had not permitted since I left the public square of Council Station on the day Jonas Hail died. Not relief. The word for it was something quieter and more permanent than relief. The particular feeling of a weight that has been sitting in one place for a long time, finally settling somewhere it can remain without constant effort to hold it. Because Jonas Hail was still gone. And I want to say that plainly, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. No treaty language fixed that. No monument fixed it. No vote in any chamber in the galaxy returned him to the Avon or put him back on the Devon coast where he had grown up looking at the water. He was gone, and that was a permanent fact about the universe that no amount of correct subsequent action could change. But something had changed, and the thing that had changed mattered. The session closed formally. Representatives moved from their positions through the chamber. Several stopped at the floor as they passed to speak directly to me. The Keth Minister of Relations shook my hand with the formal Keth grip and said that the council would be a more functional body for what had occurred, which was the most diplomatically direct thing I had ever heard a Keth say, and I thanked him for it. The Draloon senior representative stopped last. She held out her hand in the human style of greeting, which she had clearly looked up for this specific occasion. I shook it. She said, "We should have spoken 3 weeks ago." I told her yes, they should have. I said it without bitterness. Not because I had none, but because bitterness was not useful, and because she knew it was true and had already said so publicly in front of the full council, and that was what mattered going forward. I walked out of the Grand Council chamber. The corridor outside was exactly as it had always been. The same smooth stone, the same overhead lights, the same ambient sound of a space station running its ordinary operations, completely indifferent to the specific nature of what had just been decided inside the room I had just left. I had spent so much time in this corridor on the wrong side of closed doors that walking through it with the session concluded behind me had a quality I had not expected. Not triumph, something more like completion. I found a quiet section of the outer observation deck and stood at the viewport. Veth Prime curved below me, large and gray-green, wrapped in its upper atmosphere. The star field beyond it was motionless in the way that deep space is always motionless, indifferent to everything that ever occurs in front of it. I had stood at viewports like this many times in my career, at different stations and on different ships, and the view had always done the same thing to me. Made the specific concerns of any given moment feel very small relative to the scale of what was out there. This time it did the opposite. I thought about Jonas. I thought about him walking into that square with that particular settled quality in his face, finding me in a crowd of hundreds with no apparent effort, and nodding once. The gesture was so small. One brief downward movement of his chin, carrying everything it needed to carry in the space of a second, and then he was looking elsewhere, and then he was gone. I had replayed it more times than I could count over the previous 3 weeks. I could see it in complete detail in my memory, the way certain moments stay complete and precise no matter how much time passes around them. He had been the kind of person who turned a ship into forbidden territory to pull strangers out of dying life support, who did it because the alternative was something he was constitutionally unable to choose, and who had met what came after with the kind of dignity that is not performance but the natural result of having spent a life acting according to something real. I thought about what he would have made of the past 3 weeks, the infrastructure operations on 12 worlds, the fleet engagement, the council session, the enormous, complicated, consequential machinery of collective human response that his single act had set in motion. I believed he would have been somewhat embarrassed by the scale of it. He was that kind of person, the kind who helps because it is the right thing and finds the attention that sometimes follows deeply uncomfortable. He would have said it was too much. He would have meant it. But I also believed he would have understood why it had been necessary, because he was also the kind of person who understood that actions taken with genuine intent do not always get to be contained. Sometimes the thing you do becomes the hinge that everything afterward turns on, and the people who come after you carry what you started into a shape you could not have anticipated. You do not always get to choose what your courage builds. What had been built in his name was this: a legal protection that would keep the next Jonas Hail, and the one after that, from dying for saving someone's life in the wrong coordinates. A seat at a table that humanity had been sitting beside for 11 years without actually being invited to. A monument that would stand in 47 languages in the place where he had died, so that every species that walked through that square for the next 1,000 years would know his name and know what he had done and know what it had cost. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, exactly what he had died for, even though he had not known it at the time. Footsteps sounded along the observation deck corridor behind me. I turned, and Ambassador Henry Voss was walking toward me. He was in his 60s, with the permanently tired eyes of someone who had spent 30 years in interstellar diplomacy and who kept doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. He stopped beside me at the viewport and looked out at the stars without speaking. After a moment he said, "It passed." I said, "I know." We stood in silence for a while. It was a comfortable silence, the kind between people who have been through something together and do not need to immediately process it out loud. He said eventually, "What do we do now?" I thought about that genuinely, because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. I said, "Now we do the harder work. We hold them to every word of it. We make sure the protections are real when they are tested, and the seat is real when the votes are close, and the monument gets built and built correctly. We stay. We keep showing up." He nodded slowly. I said, "And we do not let anyone forget Jonas Hail." He looked at the stars for another moment. Then he said, quietly, that the Draloon child who had held Jonas's jacket had a mother who had contacted the United Nations office that morning. She wanted to speak at the monument dedication, whenever it was scheduled. I looked at him. He said, "She has been waiting 3 weeks to say thank you." I turned back to the viewport. The galaxy out there was enormous and old, and had been running according to its own established arrangements for longer than humanity had been capable of looking up at it. It had not anticipated us. It had not made particular room for us. It had observed our arrival with the mild interest of institutions that have existed long enough to feel permanent, and it had categorized us according to the variables it knew how to measure, and it had been entirely comfortable with the category it had placed us in. What it had not accounted for was the specific and persistent quality in human beings that makes it impossible to permanently define them from outside. The thing that sends people across oceans they do not know the other side of, and into space before they fully understand what space is, and into forbidden nebulae with 47 lives in the balance and 12 minutes on the clock. The thing that makes a species, once given a clear and shared reason, capable of threading itself quietly into the infrastructure of a galaxy, and then, when the moment comes, letting go of all the things it had been patiently holding. The Council had thought it understood us because it had studied our history. It had found the rope in that history, and it had learned what the rope meant. What it had not understood was that in every chapter of our history where that rope appeared, it was never the last word. It was never the thing that ended the story. It was always, without exception, the thing that started the next one. We were still here. We were still in the room. And from this point forward, when those doors opened, they would open all the way. Jonas Hail was gone, and that was a loss that I would carry in some form for the rest of my life, and I was not going to pretend otherwise, because he deserved better than to be reduced to a symbol or a catalyst or a turning point in history. He was a person from Devon who named his ships after rivers and remembered everyone's name and could not leave a person in trouble without stopping. He deserved to be remembered as that, first and last, before anything else. But 47 people were alive because of him. Their children would read his name in their own language on a stone in the square where he had died, and somewhere in the recorded history of 14 civilizations. There would be an entry for the 3 weeks when humanity stopped being small, stopped being manageable, stopped being the new and junior species that could be made an example of without consequence. The stars outside the viewport did not move. They never moved. That was the thing about deep space that always grounded me when I needed grounding. All of it out there, all that impossible distance and age, completely still, completely indifferent. And here in front of it, 76 million human beings spread across a solar system and its outer reaches, every one of them awake that morning, every one of them watching the same news feed, every one of them carrying the same name in their memory. Jonas Hail, freighter captain, Devon, England, Earth. He had saved strangers with everything he had, and the galaxy had tried to use that against us, and the galaxy had learned what that decision cost. I stayed at the viewport until the station completed its rotation, and the planet drifted out of frame, and all that remained in the glass was open space, wide and clear and fully, entirely open. Then I went back inside and started the work.